Now, before we jump into the exclusion of Black players from the National Baseball Hall of Fame, I think it would be a good idea to just set some ground information as to what were some of the factors that led to the segregation of the sport for the first 60 plus years of its history for the American and National League.
Sure. Well, the sport was segregated flat out of racism back in the 1880s. There were Black players who played professional baseball. But through the efforts of folks like Cap Anson, who is in the Hall of Fame now, he basically, and others like him, refused to put their players on the field if Black players were on the opposing team. So caving into that pressure, a quote unquote gentleman's agreement was formed to not have Black players in the major leagues anymore. And that's the way it stayed until Jackie Robinson. But the Hall of Fame was founded in the 30s in the midst of all of that. And that was during the Depression, and the area around Cooperstown was particularly hit hard by the Depression because it was a resort area and not many people were going on vacations during the Depression and whatnot. And so as they were trying to come up with something that would help the economy of the town, and they struck onto the notion of baseball because of the myth of Abner Doubleday, who was from there, supposedly inventing the sport. They decided they were going to have a baseball museum of some sort. And then Ford Frick, the president of the National League at the time, decided to say, hey, why don't you go ahead and make it a Hall of Fame, which was great. But then they needed the cooperation of baseball to do that, to get the players interested, to get artifacts, things like that. And since baseball was segregated and the Hall of Fame needed their assistance, they decided to not allow Black players in either. They basically ignored the fact that Black baseball had a rich history just as long as white baseball at that point.
And we see Jackie Robinson, like you mentioned, he's the first African-American inducted into the Hall of Fame. That was in 1962. Right. Then we see a gap where no other players are inducted. What was going on behind the scenes after Jackie Robinson? Were there people pushing for more Black players to be included, other movements going on to try and build on that momentum?
Yeah, there were. There, at kind of hand in hand with the push for integration was a push for the Hall of Fame to also integrate. So you saw that a lot in the Black media, the Pittsburgh Courier, which had Wendell Smith writing for it, and the Chicago Defender, and Sam Lacey was another Black writer who was writing about it. And they were advocating for the integration of baseball, but also saying, hey, these are Hall of Fame worthy players already playing, the Josh Gibsons and Buck Leonards of the world, Satchel Paige and so forth. So they've just continued that push once integration actually happened. And then others started slowly joining that. Some white writers started joining that. There was a guy named Dave Condon who wrote for a column for the Chicago Tribune. He was particularly vocal about making that point. And Bob Feller, of all people, spoke up on behalf of Satchel Paige, who was his teammate at one point, despite the fact that he had not been great in his relations with the Black players that he'd been teammates with Larry Doby, with Satchel Paige. There had been a lot of tension there. He, at one point, said he didn't think Jackie Robinson would make it in baseball. He didn't believe that he had the skill set to do it. He was a controversial guy on this particular subject, but he stood up for Satchel Paige's inclusion in the Hall of Fame right around the time that he was elected, which ironically was 1962, the same year as Jackie Robinson. So there was a little bit of that, but the real push came when Ted Williams, in his induction in 1966, literally on the steps of the Hall of Fame, said that he felt there was a place for the Josh Gibsons and Satchel Paiges of the world. And the Hall of Fame really couldn't ignore it at that point, since he literally said it with all of their leadership behind him. At that point, the wheels started turning a little bit more. You started getting folks like Dick Young, a very influential writer, columnist for the New York Daily News, threw his weight behind that in his columns. And then Bowie Kuhn, who was the new commissioner in the late 60s, had been a fan of the Homestead Grays growing up in Washington, D.C., where the Grays played half of their games. He'd been a scoreboard operator and had watched those games at Griffith Stadium, and he got behind it as well. And they all kind of then pulled together to push the Hall of Fame leadership, which included Ford Frick at that point. He had stopped being president of the National League and then commissioner of baseball. And by this point, he was chairman of the board of the Hall, and was still opposed to having Negro Leaguers in. But that conglomeration of folks kind of finally pushed him to do the right thing.
So who were some of the Negro League players that benefited from this push after Jackie Robinson was inducted, who were able to finally get their names in the Hall?
Yeah, it was when they first decided to do it, they were going to do it in Not the greatest way, in very much a separate but equal way. They said, we'll put in basically an all-star team. We'll put in one person per position. They kind of fudged it ultimately by putting Martin DeHigo in as a second baseman when he really wasn't. But that's essentially what they did. They were going to put them all in as one big display, not as actual Hall of Famers with their own individual plaques in the plaque room. They were going to have a separate place to honor them. And when that became clear, and after this special committee was formed and picked Satchel Paige as the first one, and it became clear that that was how he was going to go in, he very famously said, I'd love to go in the Hall of Fame, but I'm not going in the back door. And lots of media members and whatnot basically said the same thing, that this is, you're essentially segregating the Hall of Fame. Sure, you're letting them in, but it's separate but equal. You're not putting them in as equals of the same, of the white players who'd been in before.
Right.
They changed that, thankfully, and did put those players in as, as individuals, so that you finally got that first wave of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard and Cool Papa Bell and those guys. But they were essentially an all-star team, one per position. The bad part about that is that, for instance, because one pitcher was already in, Satchel Paige, they couldn't put in Bullet Rogan, for instance, because another ridiculously good Negro pitcher was not able to be put in the Hall of Fame, because the way they decided to do it was, no, we were only having one per position. They could have put Bullet Rogan as an outfielder, but they already kind of had that slotted for the Monty Irvins and Cool Papa Bells of the world. So he wound up not getting in that first wave. He might have been the best Negro Leagues player ever. Certainly in terms of like a Shohei Ohtani, he could do both. He could pitch and hit ridiculously well, but he had to be skipped because of how they decided to structure that first wave of inductees.
And there seems to be more waves that occurred after this, initial push at the end of the 60s.